The gathering storm. Today, the storm gathers once more, and as we watch China undertake the largest peacetime military buildup since at least World War II, and it finds eager friends in Tehran, Moscow, we of history. Problems, it's true in life as much as it is in geopolitics. Problems do not age well. We ignore them at our peril. Appeasement or over-reliance on polite diplomacy cannot save us. We must act decisively to enhance our military strength, support our allies, and deter this authoritarian alignment. Only strength will be able to withstand the storm. Again, we're privileged to have two public servants, two former secretaries. Secretary Pompeo was Secretary of State and CIA Director during the Trump administration. He also served the 4th District of Kansas in Congress from 2011 to 2017. Secretary Pompeo was Director of the CIA, as well as the Secretary of Defense under President Barack Obama. He had previously served as Chief of Staff for former President Bill Clinton, and in what was his best job, apparently, as a member of Congress from California from 1977 to 1993. We thank both of you for making time out of your busy schedules to be here. If you could please stand and raise your right hand, I will now swear you in. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Let the record show the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. You may be seated. Thank you, Secretary Pompeo. You are recognized for your opening remarks.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Krishnamurti. It's great to be here. I started my career at Canon 107, so it feels like home very much. It's a real privilege to be in front of this particular committee. You all are doing important, remarkable, bipartisan work, and I want to personally, on behalf of the Pompeo family, thank you, each of you, for doing that. It matters to my family. It matters to each American, and I bless you for that. You all have in front of you, much like I did in my time in Congress, important decisions. We have wars raging in Europe, in the Middle East. There's risk of one in South America, much closer to home even. And of course, the topic we're here today to talk about, the challenges in the Pacific and Asia, are in front of us as well. I know that you will endeavor to get these decisions right. To start, I always try to get to the facts. I'm going to try and do this in just 3 minutes. We've got linked, not just about one of these theaters, one of these zones, one of these regions, but these are all deeply linked to whether America will have the resolve, determination, and capacity to deter and maintain the order that we have benefited, that Americans have benefited from since the post-Cold War order was established. We know that this conflict largely begins with economics. Chinese Communist Party has been at war with the United States economy for at least 20 years. One could argue 40. It might well have made sense for the esteemed Dr. Kissinger to go and travel and open up relationships with the Chinese Communist Party back in 1972. It might have made sense in 1982. It made no sense by 2002, 2012, and certainly today makes no sense. It's dangerous for the United States to allow the Chinese Communist Party to have engaged here at home in ways that undermine the very foundations of our republic. And I know I'll get asked about this today, but I think it's important that when we think of the challenge from the Chinese Communist Party, we think not only about Taiwan, not only about the South Pacific and about the First Island chain, but about Los Angeles and Denver and Washington, D.C., Chicago, and my home state of Kansas. The Chinese Communist Party is working diligently inside the gates to undermine everything it is that we stand for. When he talks about American decline, he is not doing so passively. He is an advocate. He is working to achieve that very American decline here at home. The last thought. Secretary Burnett, it is great to be with you here today. And I think it's important for America to see that this challenge is not remotely about politics. It is not remotely partisan. It is so much more fundamental than that. I have been critical of many of President Biden's foreign policy actions, but I must say the work that they continue to do to confront the challenge of China, I have approved and appreciated. I always knew that we could do more. They could do more as well, and I'm counting on this committee to help us get to that place. When we put sanctions in place, we can't immediately turn around and create loopholes. When we put in place economic orders that suggest how America ought to proceed. We cannot let our adversaries, whether they be from Russia, escape those sanctions regime, and we have to make sure that our friends comply with them as well. This will require temerity from each of us. The Chinese Communist Party is not about to give in because of some great speech that someone gives, some set of wonderful remarks, or a set of meetings held in San Francisco or Beijing or Washington, D.C. They are determined. They will push back against our actions, and we need to make sure that we hold the Chinese Communist Party at risk in the same way that they seek to put America at risk each day. If we get that piece right, tactics, the operational pieces, we'll get those. A strong United States military, capable diplomatic corps, and a robust American economy can deliver those outcomes in a way that will give us the chance that 250 years from now, the 76th or 79th Secretary of State can sit here with his Democrat counterpart from a previous administration and still have the opportunity to defend what we hold most sacred. Thanks for giving me the chance to be with you all today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for those great remarks. Secretary Panetta, you are now recognized for your opening statement.
The highest art is beautiful, breathtaking, timeless, and moving. Experience art with 5,000 years of history.
On the increasing threat posed by the People's Republic of China and its ongoing efforts to undermine the United States and allied interests around the world. And thank you for having me join with my good friend, Mike Pompeo, who we worked together when he was in my job as director of the CIA, and continued to be in touch during the time he was Secretary of State. Mike and I are good friends, and I'm glad that we are here to be able to present our views. I also want to thank this committee. The fact that you are a bipartisan committee working on this issue is incredibly important to our foreign policy. And I want to commend you for the work that you've done, and particularly the report you issued on economic competition. Look, we live in a dangerous world in which tyrants and autocrats and terrorists are challenging and attacking democracies. And so they're threatening our values. They're threatening our interests and our national security. When Putin brutally invaded Ukraine, it was for no other reason but that he did not believe the people of Ukraine had the right to decide how to govern themselves. I believe Ukraine is fighting not just to protect their democracy, but to protect the concept of democracy in the 21st century. When Hamas attacked and brutally killed innocent men, women, and children in Israel, they, like Al-Qaeda on 9/11, made clear that they had no regard for the dignity of life. And Hamas's leadership does need to be destroyed, just as we targeted and destroyed Al-Qaeda leadership. We are facing an aligned group of dictators and autocrats from around the world, united in their determination to undermine our democracy. China is exploiting these conflicts to advance its own narrative of Western decline. She explicitly said the East is rising and the West is declining, and that China will replace the United States as a world power. I've met with Xi multiple times during the time I was in office, here and in Beijing. He's smart, he can be very diplomatic, he's committed to an aggressive China. But it is important that we never underestimate Xi Jinping, because he will use every opportunity to undermine the stability of the United States and the West. He will steal our intellectual property, conduct economic espionage, have extensive intelligence. I believe they planted malware within our own computer networks. He will use artificial intelligence for disinformation campaigns. He will militarize and continue to militarize the South China Sea. He will modernize the People's Liberation Army, They have the largest Navy. They're producing large numbers of manned and unmanned aircraft, ICBMs. They're expanding their nuclear arsenal. They have 500 warheads, and they hope to double that by the end of the decade. As a result, they are not simply developing what could be called the general purpose military. They're developing a military that can employ the threat and the use of force. Xi Jinping recently said the reunification of the motherland is a historical necessity. And so there's no question they threaten Taiwan. The president was correct to say that we will defend Taiwan militarily if it comes to that. I have always believed strongly that when the U.S. gives its word, it must stand by its word. That is the essence of deterrence. The bottom line is we are facing an increasingly aligned group of autocrats around the world. And the fact is that they are now having dual-use technologies that are being spread with Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea. While this alignment of autocrats is troubling, the good news is that it does not even come close to approaching the strength and depth and breadth of the United States' global network of allies and partners. Look, some have suggested that our relationship with China is improving, and there's no question we've had increased military and economic dialogue. But make no mistake, the only way to try to avoid war with China, the only way to deal with China is from strength. From strength. Both China and Russia became more aggressive when they sensed weakness on the part of the U.S. And for that reason, we must take strong action to arm and train Taiwan to defend itself, to strengthen our force posture, to invest in the next generation of military technology, to bolster our alliances, and to maintain strong export controls on critical technologies. And I must say, we must demonstrate that our democracy is strong and that we can govern. For that reason, it is incredibly important that this Congress pass the supplemental request and provide necessary military aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. To fail would send a terrible message of weakness to adversaries and allies alike. We'll be playing China's game. And let me make clear that those who believe the United States can simply back away from our commitment in Ukraine, you cannot be weak on Ukraine and be tough on China. In conclusion, let me just say, I tell the students at the Panetta Institute that in our democracy, we govern either by leadership or by crisis. If we fail to provide leadership, then we will govern by crisis. And the price of that is the loss of the trust of the American people in our democracy. This committee provides hope that we can govern and work together in a real sense. Our democracy and our national security depend on each of you for your leadership necessary to govern and protect our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We've released three major policy reports that were the culmination of a year's worth of work, investigations, hearings.
The hearing is called Better Investment Barriers, Strengthening CCP Sanctions, and Exploring Alternatives to Bureaucratic Regimes.
Witnesses say the U.S. needs to protect its national security and maintain its global technology leadership amid China's ambitions.
Their suggestions include better transparency around investments made in China, additional prohibitions related to emerging technology, targeted outbound investment controls, and collaborating with allies.
The witnesses named several sensitive technologies that the U.S. needs to pay attention to. They include quantum computing, artificial intelligence, semiconductor development, hypersonics, and supercomputing. Will Chinese property developer Evergrande follow a court order to liquidate? And what will be the impact on the Chinese economy if it does? Entity Business's Don Ma speaks to a specialist on the topic.
And now joining us is Brian McCarthy from Macro Lens. So to start off quickly, give us your take on the whole Evergrande situation being ordered to liquidate.
Yeah, certainly the news hits in an environment of extreme angst regarding Chinese equities. So it was taken bearish by Chinese equity indices last night. But in effect, I don't really think this is going to change the story all that much. It's unlikely, in my view, that the domestic authorities in China will abide by a winding down order from a Hong Kong court.
So if Chinese authorities are weighing the pros and cons, do you think it would be more beneficial for them to let things be as it is right now instead of liquidating?
They don't seem to have a better plan. To some extent, I'm surprised they haven't simply nationalized Evergrande, handed off the assets to state-owned developers, and had the state fill the hole in the financing to get these apartments delivered. But I think the problem extends well beyond developers that have unfinished apartments and terrible finances, because the entire real estate market is effectively falling apart.
So basically, you're saying bluntly that Chinese authorities are not going to listen to the order from a Hong Kong court. But maybe paint us a picture, like if Evergrande were to be liquidated, what would the impact be on the overall economy in China?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine it being liquidated. If they actually were to try to find a clearing price for Evergrande's assets, it would simply accelerate the process that's going on, which is we are finding what these real estate assets are really worth. That some, call it $80 trillion worth of Chinese real estate, isn't worth $80 trillion, it's worth $40 trillion.
All right, final question. Any way to fix the property crisis in China?
No, there's no way to fix any of this. I know international investors keep looking around the next corner for some big policy, bullet to fix this. There is no fixing it. You're going to take the value of residential real estate in China down by tens of trillions of dollars.
All right, thank you very much, Brian McCarthy, Chief Strategist, Macro Lens.
Thanks, Tom.
Beijing lodging a complaint to Washington over the treatment of Chinese students arriving to study in America. The Chinese regime alleged the students were interrogated.
Isolate the Kremlin through economic sanctions, Russia has redirected its exports from Europe to China. Aside from Moscow, Beijing also sources its fuel from Iran. The Middle Eastern regime's crude oil exports just topped its 5-year record, with China being its #1 buyer. According to former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, the CCP's alliance with American adversaries isn't solely driven by economic benefits.
It is, Xi Jinping is driven by a Marxist-Leninist ideology. This is not an effort to improve life for the Chinese people. This is an effort for aggregation of power for the Chinese Communist Party.
Pompeo also reminded lawmakers about the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic.
It's hard to imagine the staggering impact that COVID had on the world, and yet no one's held Xi Jinping accountable. But for the fact that once he was aware that he had a leak from his lab of a relatively lethal, relatively contagious virus, he voiced it upon the world.
On the Pacific front, Committee Chairman Mike Gallagher told me that Washington's commitment to Taiwan is meant for deterring and preventing conflicts from escalating. That's despite Beijing seeking to take the self-governed island by force if necessary.
Conventional deterrence, in particular in the Indo-Pacific, I think should be the top priority of the entire national security and defense establishment. We have to have a global strategy because we're a global superpower. That's where we can leverage allies and partners, but that's the name of the game.
I think we've got to continue to support them because they are critical to our security in the Pacific.
Reporting from Capitol Hill, Sam Wong, NTD News. Institute at the International Religious Freedom Summit in D.C. earlier today. Antonia Ferrier, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, Antonia, your work right now is focused around the world. You guys, give us a little bit of background about the organization that you're with and some of the work when it comes to religious freedom that you're doing.
We are a democracy organization. We work in over 100 countries around the world, on every continent, obviously except Antarctica. And we're standing up for freedom and liberty. And too often in a lot of autocratic regimes and countries, any challenge or threat to the regime, even faith, which is so hard to fathom, is a threat, and regimes will crack down. And so we do a lot of work in Cuba and Nicaragua, for example, where for the regimes both in Cuba and Nicaragua, faith is a threat. And in Nicaragua in particular, the Ortega regime just exiled 17 Catholic priests out, and they're now at the Vatican. There is a bishop there, Bishop Alvarez, who is just a testament to bravery and strength. Last year, the regime sent out 222 individuals out of Nicaragua to the United States. He refused to go. He went back into prison. And things have just gotten so bad in Nicaragua, where the regime has shut down a Catholic university, has really persecuted people of faith, in particular the Catholic Church. And so 17 just went out, were sent out in the Vatican right now. So our work around political freedom and religious freedom in so many places goes hand in hand. Cuba, you have a similar situation where the regime just cannot stand for any threat to its power. Cuba is interesting in terms of its faith community. Yes, it is obviously Catholic, but also there are evangelical leaders as well who have been persecuted by the regime as well. So, in support of freedom, for us, political and religious freedom cannot be separated. For the Uyghurs, their community in Western China that have been really undergoing just a brutal suppression of their faith and their beliefs in Western China, we are happy to work with them, try and support them as best we can. And of course, Communist China, anything that is a threat to its rule, if you're a Tibetan, the Tibetans know firsthand what it means.
How concerned are you that some of these South American and Central American countries that used to be our allies are kind of leaning more toward communism?
Well, the Communist Party of China is, and Xi Jinping in particular, they are relentless. And so, if you sort of step back, the Cuban regime, the Nicaraguan regime, they're a bit like throwbacks to the 70s and 80s. This is Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. For those of you who remember the 80s, he's back, he's been back. And so they're sort of this old school Soviet model communism. The difference, I would say, with the Communist Party of China and what Xi Jinping is doing around the world, they use every tool at their disposal to try and pressure countries into being sort of in their worldview. Sometimes it's with money, economic incentives, and things like that. And, they're effective. But I do think at the end of the day, if you were to ask the average citizen, whether it be, in Nigeria or in Colombia, which model would they rather be with? Would they rather be as an individual in terms of freedom-loving peoples with communist China or with the United States and other freedom-loving societies? I think most people would say with us.
How important is it for our elected officials to speak up about this? And what impact does it have in restraining authoritarian regimes from further persecution of their people?
The more people that speak out and say no, you know what? It's not okay for people, for Tibetans, for example, to be sort of plowed into line by the Communist Party of China. It's not okay for Christians in Nigeria to be slaughtered, frankly, at the hands of certain extremists. Is so important in terms of showcasing to the world that the United States is a place of freedom and liberty, and that we still remain that shining beacon on the hill.
Antonia Ferrier, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.